Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? She stood near the back, headset in hand, waiting for an assignment she already knew would never come. The hum of radar screens lit the faces of her colleagues in soft green. Voices overlapped, calm and confident, each controller taking their place for another day guiding steel and fire through the skis over Munich. And there she was, Anderson, just 23, the youngest controller at one of Europe's busiest airports, the one no one quite trusted when things went wrong. It didn't matter that she'd memorized every regulation in the book, that she could calculate wind shear adjustments in her head before anyone else even opened the software, that she spoke 4 languages fluently, able to calm the nervous voice of a pilot no matter what country he came from. What mattered was the story they had already written for her. Too young, too emotional, too much of a liability when 400 souls sat strapped into a fuselage at 35,000 feet. Sector 7, domestic training flights, that's you, Anderson. The words dropped from senior controller like a judge's sentence. His voice was sharp, his expression neutral. He didn't need to explain. He never did. Sector 7 again. A corner of the tower, no one, small regional aircraft, training runs, routine handoffs, the safest space to keep her contained. Nodded, her face calm, her pen already poised over her notepad. But inside, a familiar ache pressed against her ribs around her. Colleagues exchanged knowing glances, subtle smirks, even a few sighs of relief that she hadn't been chosen for anything critical. She heard the whispers as the briefing dissolved. Good thing she's not on approach. She gets too invested, too emotional. I wouldn't trust her with a real emergency. She pretended not to hear, she always pretended, but the words clung to her skin like frost, cold and cutting. What they didn't see, what none of them ever asked, was how much she had prepared. Every night long after her shifts, sat in her small Munich apartment surrounded by maps, approach plates, storm pattern analyses. She had built a home simulator with money she didn't have, pieced together from second jobs and sacrificed weekends. While her colleagues laughed over beer in the city, she sat alone with glowing screens, running scenario after scenario, engine fires, hydraulic failures, diversions in snowstorms. She memorized everything. She rehearsed everything. She wasn't waiting for opportunity, she was training for it. And yet, every morning, the tower reminded her she wasn't enough. The sun rose over the Bavarian Alps that day, painting the runways gold. Traffic was already stacking over southern Germany. Frankfurt was on strike, which meant Munich would pick up the slack. It was the kind of morning that defined careers in air traffic control. Heavy loads, complicated reroutes, weather moving in. For everyone else. For it was just another day in Sector 7. Her console hummed as she guided a turboprop from Vienna down to the tarmac. Her voice was steady, her instructions crisp. Turn left heading 090, descend to 3000, cleared ILS approach runway 26 left. The captain thanked her, routine, smooth, efficient. But saw more than routine, she saw an opening. With Frankfurt closed, regional traffic doubled, holding patterns lengthened, fuel reports grew. Controllers on primary approach were already stretched thin, and while most would have accepted delays, quietly adjusted her spacing, reshuffled her patterns, and slid aircraft through invisible seams. Within an hour, she had turned chaos into clockwork. Eurowings 447 requesting priority, fuels getting low. Her heart quickened, but her voice remained calm. She carved them into her sequence, weaving 3 other aircraft around them without breaking stride. 12 minutes later, 4 planes touched down, each on time, none in conflict. She leaned back, eyes on the screen, not a single second wasted, not a drop of fuel spilled into unnecessary holds. It was perfect, and yet invisible. Only one person seemed to notice. A controller on primary approach, drifted by during lunch. He leaned close, his voice quieter than usual. How did you sequence those so cleanly? I was watching. You had them flowing like water. Hesitated, then slid her notebook across the desk. Its pages were filled with her handwritten charts. Wake turbulence spacing, performance profiles for every aircraft type, calculations for fuel efficiency under different altitudes. She had studied it all alone, long after shifts ended. His eyes widened. You did all this yourself. She nodded. He shook his head slowly, a flicker of respect she hadn't seen before. That's graduate-level work. But then he walked away, back to his platform, back to the world that would never let her in. That night her apartment glowed again with screens, weather radar, traffic flows, emergency manuals in 4 languages. She practiced until dawn, exhaustion gnawing at her temples. Alone, unseen, she trained harder than anyone. For what? The question haunted her. Was she chasing a moment that would never come? Would she always be the little bird, stuck in the shadows while others were trusted with the skis? She thought of her colleagues' laughter, the way they brushed her aside during simulations. Observers only, Anderson. They never let her participate, they never let her prove herself. Her preparation became both her lifeline and her prison. One evening she sat staring at her notes, her chest tight. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was too emotional, too invested. Maybe her care for every voice on the frequency was a weakness. And yet, every time a pilot thanked her, every time she caught the tremor in their voice and steadied it with her calm reassurance, she knew her empathy wasn't weakness. It was the very reason she was good. She refused to let them take that from her. The storm arrived 3 weeks later. Low pressure, fierce winds from the Alps, turbulence reports filling the radio. Frankfurt and Stuttgart went into ground stop. Munich was the last option. The room buzzed with tension and stood at the podium, assigning roles for what would be one of the toughest days the tower had seen in years. Primary approach, departure, weather coordination. One by one, names filled the critical posts. Sat, pulse quickening. She had prepared for this. Wind shear, fuel emergencies, non-standard approaches. She had studied for nights just like this. Surely they would see it now. Anderson, Sector 7, domestic traffic. We need you reliable with the regionals. The words struck like a blade. Again. Even today, even now. As she walked to her console, she heard them. The voices that had haunted her since the first day. Can you imagine her on approach today? She'd probably break down if a pilot declared an emergency. I need ice in the veins up there, not someone who cares too much. Her chest burned. She bit her lip hard enough to taste blood. They would never let her prove them wrong, not here, not under their rules. And so she sat in Sector 7, headset on, watching from the periphery as her colleagues wrestled storms and emergencies. She guided her regional flights with the same precision as always, unseen, unheard, her skills buried beneath their assumptions. But as she worked, she whispered a promise only she could hear. One day the sky will test us all. And when that day comes, when the air cracks with desperation, when the voices on the frequency tremble with fear, they will hear me. And I will not falter. Because sometimes, strength isn't proven in the spotlight, it's forged in the shadows. What happens when preparation meets a locked door? When you've trained for a storm, lived for it, dreamed of it, and they tell you your place is in the shadows. The morning briefing began with a heaviness could feel before a word was spoken. The storm system stretched across southern Germany, a churning wall of wind shear and turbulence sliding down from the Alps. Radar screens painted it in angry colors, green, yellow, red. By noon, Munich would be the only major hub still open. Director stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. Beside him, looked 20 years older in the harsh fluorescent light. This is going to test us, said. His voice carried a weight that filled the room. Frankfurt and Stuttgart have shut down. We'll be taking their traffic. Conditions are deteriorating fast. We cannot afford mistakes. His pulse quickened. This was it, the kind of day she'd prepared for. Nights spent studying weather theory, weekends rehearsing storm scenarios on her simulator. She could see the patterns in her mind already, the alternate approaches, the fuel optimization strategies. She knew this storm better than anyone in the room. Primary approach. Departure. Storm coordination. The names rolled on, each one like a nail in her coffin. Anderson, Sector 7, domestic, handle the regional diversions. Her stomach dropped, even now, even with the sky on fire. She forced her face neutral, but the words carved through her ribs like glass around her. A few controllers exchanged smirks, one even chuckled. Thank God she's not on primary today. She'd be in tears before the first Mayday. She pretended not to hear. She always pretended, but the storm outside wasn't half as violent as the storm inside her chest. For hours she worked, quietly guiding regional flights while chaos thundered at the center of the tower. Fuel emergencies, severe turbulence, runway changes, her colleagues. Voices grew clipped, tense, sweat beaded on brows that normally looked carved from stone. And still she was sidelined, watching, knowing she could do more. By the end of that week, her frustration had hardened into something heavier, not anger, not disappointment, something worse, a realization that excellence here didn't matter, that no matter how perfectly she worked, how flawlessly she prepared, she would never be trusted with more. 3 weeks later, the meeting confirmed it. Conference Room B, sterile walls, a polished table spread with her entire personnel file like evidence in a trial. And Dr. Elizabeth from Psychological Services, her pen poised, her eyes sharp. Anderson began, his voice flat. You're here because we have concerns about your approach to responsibilities, concerns that could affect your future at Munich Tower. Her throat tightened. This wasn't a review, this was judgment. Sir, my performance metrics have been consistently excellent, 0 errors, highest pilot satisfaction scores. Cut her off, sliding his notes closer. Your technical performance isn't in question. What concerns us is your behavior, your focus, he glanced at, your inability to stay within assigned boundaries. Leaned forward, her tone clinical. Your supervisors report you've been studying procedures far outside your clearance, documenting inefficiencies, preparing analyses that aren't part of your role. Some interpret this as undermining authority, others as unrealistic ambition. The words hit like a slap, her months of sacrifice reframed as rebellion. With respect, said, her voice trembling but firm, I've only tried to prepare myself for greater responsibilities. If the day comes when I'm needed, I want to be ready. The problem, snapped, is that your definition of ready conflicts with the structure this facility depends on. Clear chains of command, defined roles. When junior controllers decide for themselves what to study, it creates chaos. Chaos, that was what they called her discipline, her endless nights of study. Finally spoke, his gravel voice heavy with finality. Anderson, you were hired for specific duties. Your constant push beyond those duties suggests either dissatisfaction with your role or an inappropriate level of ambition. Her hands curled into fists under the table. She wanted to scream, to tell them about the hours, the sacrifice, the nights spent alone memorizing every possible emergency scenario. But she saw it in their eyes. They weren't here to listen. They were here to decide her fate. Doctor folded her hands. We recommend a development plan tailored to your strengths, domestic operations specialization, regional traffic, training coordination within your limits. Limits, that word again. It tasted like iron in her mouth. What if I refuse? Asked quietly. His gaze was cold. Refusal would suggest unwillingness to accept guidance. It could lead to reassignment, a smaller facility, less demanding work. A transfer, exile disguised as mercy. Her heart pounded. They weren't just overlooking her anymore. They were walling her in, containing her, making sure she would never rise, never touch the console where real emergencies lived. She walked out of that room with her pulse roaring in her ears, her file stamped with words she could never erase. Technically competent, emotionally unsuitable for high-pressure operations. That night she sat in her apartment staring at her notebooks, charts, simulations, wind pattern studies, efficiency analyses, piles of brilliance that no one would ever see. For a moment she thought about tearing it all down, burning it, accepting the small box they had built for her. But then she closed the binder carefully, placed it back on the shelf, and whispered to the empty room. "No, not yet, not like this." The weeks that followed grew darker, whispers spread through the tower. Her dedication was twisted into suspicion. Colleagues murmured about her intensity, her secret notes, her obsession with procedures that weren't hers to know. She felt the shift in the air. Eyes that once her now watched with something colder, doubt, distrust, as though excellence itself had become dangerous when it came from her. The breaking point came when Captain, a regional pilot, once again praised her efficiency to the supervisors. "That young controller runs sequences than anyone else on your staff. She should be on approach." The reply was crushing. Routine excellence doesn't equal emergency performance. Routine excellence, that was all she was allowed to be. And yet, as December crept in and the storm season deepened, something stirred in her gut, the same feeling that had kept her awake at night studying fuel flow charts while the city slept. She knew it, she could feel it in her bones. A test was coming, one that would strip away every lie, every limitation, every label they'd given her. And when it came, when the radio cracked with desperation and the sky darkened with failure, it would not be calm voices or cold detachment that saved lives. It would be someone who cared too much, someone who had prepared for everything. It would be her. What would you do if the sky itself begged for your voice? The call came at 14:23, a crisp December afternoon, when the Bavarian light turned silver and the world outside the tower looked deceptively calm. "Mayday, Mayday, Munich Tower, 441 declaring emergency. We have complete hydraulic failure, requesting immediate assistance." The words shattered the air, conversations froze, the hum of the tower shifted into something heavier, sharper. This was the moment every controller trained for, and the moment most hoped they would never face. On the radar screen, a massive Airbus A340 blinked southeast of Munich, its flight path wobbling, its altitude bleeding away. 298 passengers, 35,000 feet, no hydraulics. No normal control. Senior controller was already at the mic. His voice came steady, practiced, carrying the authority of 20 years. 441 Munich Tower copies, state your intentions. The pilot's reply came ragged, edged with strain. "We have no flight controls, limited directional response using engines only, landing gear unresponsive, request immediate vectors. We are struggling to maintain stability." The control room moved like a body hit with electricity, and dove into approach charts, checked fuel calculations, barked for emergency services to clear the longest runway. Every voice was tense, every movement urgent. And she sat at Sector 7, headset on, silent, watching. Her heart pounded as she traced the flight path on her own screen. She knew the standard procedures they would try. She also knew they wouldn't work. Not for this, not for a hydraulic failure at that altitude, in that position with those winds. She had studied this. She had rehearsed this exact nightmare in her apartment 100 times. A modified straighten approach, long vectors, minimal course corrections. It was the only way. But no one looked at her. No one asked. She wasn't even supposed to be listening. His voice filled the room. 441, can you maintain heading for another 10 minutes while we coordinate? Negative, the pilot's response cut like glass. Aircraft handling is deteriorating, fuel remaining. 30 minutes. We cannot maintain current heading without vectors. The silence that followed was suffocating. Controllers leaned in, whispering, calculating, could hear the panic underneath the professionalism. They were trying to fit a broken aircraft into procedures that weren't built for this. And all the while, the minutes ticked down, 30:29. She looked around the room, his jaw tight, scribbling numbers that didn't add up, barking orders no one could follow fast enough. They didn't see it, they couldn't see it. But she did. Her chest tightened, her palms grew damp. This was it. The moment she had whispered about to herself in the quiet of her apartment. The test. The reason she had studied until her eyes blurred and her savings drained. But to speak, to step forward, meant crossing a line she could never uncross. If she was wrong, if her solution failed, she would carry the deaths of 300 people on her shoulders, and her career would be over before it ever began. But if she stayed silent, she closed her eyes, she could hear the pilot's voice again. Families with young children aboard. His words had cracked. Just slightly, under the weight of command, he wasn't just a captain anymore. He was a father pleading with strangers to bring his people home. Her throat burned, her hands trembled. She knew what had to be done. Slowly she pushed her chair back. The wheels scraped against the floor, too loud in the tense quiet, heads turned, eyes narrowed, brows drew tight. She stepped forward, her voice steady even as her heart raced. "Sir," she said, her words cutting through the air like a blade, "I have an approach solution that will work for their condition." The room froze. Dozens of eyes locked on her, the youngest, the most doubted, the one they had called too emotional, too fragile. "Anderson," snapped, his voice sharp with disbelief. "This is not the time for speculation, we need proven procedures." Held his gaze. "With respect, sir, the proven procedures won't save them." The silence thickened. Her colleague stared as though she had spoken blasphemy. His face hardened. "Out of line, return to your station immediately." She looked past him, to the radar, to the flickering dot that carried nearly 300 souls and was bleeding fuel by the second. And she knew. Her career was already gone the moment she stood, but their lives didn't have to be. Munich Tower 441, aircraft becoming increasingly unstable, fuel estimate, 20 minutes. The pilot's voice cracked again, desperate, urgent. Drew in a long breath. Her decision crystallized in that moment. She wasn't asking permission anymore. She was taking responsibility. She stepped toward the primary console, her hand hovered over the controls, reached out, his voice low, almost pleading now. "If you're wrong, they die, are you certain?" Her eyes met his. For once, she didn't look like the little bird they had named her. She looked like the storm itself. "I am more certain of this than anything in my life," she said. "I have studied this scenario, I have practiced it. I know the vectors, I know Munich's airspace better than anyone. Let me save them." The seconds stretched, the clock ticked, 20 minutes 19. Behind her hissed, "If you touch that console, you end your career, you'll answer for it legally, walk away now." Closed her eyes. She saw her apartment lit with maps and charts. She saw nights spent alone while the world laughed without her. She saw every whisper, every dismissal, every time they told her she was not enough. And she saw the radar, the flicker of an Airbus fighting for its life. Her eyes opened. She placed her hand on the console. "441," she said into the mic, her voice carrying a calm it had never carried before. "This is Munich Tower. I will guide you through a modified approach pattern designed for your condition. Trust me, I will get you home." The control room erupted, half outrage, half stunned silence. His hand twitched toward the phone to call security. But then the radio crackled back. "Munich Tower, 441, we copy. Standing by for your vectors." The pilot had chosen, he trusted her. Anderson had crossed the point of no return. 300 lives now rested on the one controller no one had ever trusted. How many lives can balance on a single voice? 441, turn left heading 085, maintain gentle bank. Do not exceed 5 degrees, descend, flight level 100. Words carried across the radio, steady as stone, even as her hands trembled just out of sight. On the radar screen, the Airbus obeyed slowly, painfully, like a wounded animal limping through the sky. The control room had gone still, a room full of professionals holding their breath, watching the youngest and least trusted among them take command of the most desperate emergency they had ever faced. Stood rigid, his face carved with fury. Arms were crossed, his eyes locked on the radar, every muscle tense around them. Controllers exchanged looks, some disbelief, some fear, some a flicker of something else. Hope. Munich Tower 441. The pilot's voice broke through again, strained, clipped, every syllable forced. Aircraft responding sluggish, control limited, fuel remaining, 14 minutes. Her chest tightened, time was vanishing like sand through a fist. Copy 441, she said softly, almost like she was speaking directly to him. Stay with me, we'll keep this straight, extend your descent slowly, reduce thrust on engines 2 and 3, maintain balance with 1 and 4, you're doing fine. Her voice was calm, gentle. It carried something the others didn't: care, not detachment, not cold precision, care. And somehow, through the static, she could feel the captain breathe easier. Behind her snapped, Anderson, enough, you've had your moment, get off that console before you kill them. But didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed on the flickering green echo of the Airbus as it traced her path. Turn right heading 095, long final. You'll have 12 nautical miles straight in. The aircraft turned, sluggish but obedient. A straight path began to form on the screen, a corridor carved from chaos. Leaned forward, whispering like he almost couldn't believe it. She's building them a glide slope. The pilot came back, his voice ragged with exhaustion. Munich Tower control unstable, heavy turbulence, aircraft shaking. His hand tightened on the desk. She imagined the cabin, families clutching each other, children crying, oxygen masks swaying, the captain staring at controls that barely responded. You're not alone, she whispered into the mic. You're still flying, keep her steady, we're almost there. Her colleagues shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away, some leaned closer, listening. Minutes bled into seconds, 11 minutes of fuel, then 10. Descend 2000, maintain heading. You'll intercept final approach. The radio crackled. Copy, but landing gear unresponsive. We may have no wheels. The room froze. Even the hum of electronics felt muted. Inhaled slowly. This was worse than she had planned for, but not impossible. She had studied this. She had rehearsed for partial gear failures, belly landings, emergency foams. She steadied her voice. Keep your focus on control. Emergency crews are ready. Long runway is clear. We'll guide you in shallow. Touchdown will be hard but survivable. She said it with such certainty that even the walls seemed to believe her. The minutes collapsed 9-8. The Airbus crept toward Munich. Its radar trace, now perfectly aligned with the modified path had envisioned in countless sleepless nights. Behind her, whispers stirred, muttered, "Damn, she's holding them steady," shook his head, his eyes wide. "It's working." But still seethed. "Luck," he spat. "If they make it, it's luck, and if they don't." Then she was the only one who tried. Cut him off quietly, his voice heavier than the storm itself. 7 minutes 6. The pilot's voice cracked through again, breaking like a man fighting to sound calm for his crew. Munich Tower, difficulty maintaining glide path, engines 1 and 2 unresponsive, aircraft shaking violently. Every ear strained for response. Her lips were pale, her knuckles white, but her voice never wavered. "Stay with me, Captain. You are lined up perfectly. 3 more minutes, hold your descent shallow. Use engines 3 and 4 for balance, you've got this." Silence, then a broken exhale. Copy, holding, following vectors. On the radar, the dot inched closer. The runway alignment glowed like a lifeline. 4 minutes of fuel. Emergency trucks were already roaring across the tarmac below. Foam cannons primed, fire crews in position. Every light on the runway blazed white. Munich's heart was open wide, waiting. The room held its breath. 441, altitude 1000. You are clear to land straight ahead. The seconds stretched. The radar flicker merged with the glowing line of runway. And then, Munich Tower, 441 touchdown. The control room erupted, shouts, gasps, applause breaking like a wave against stone. The Airbus thundered down the strip, sparks flashing as its broken gear collapsed, emergency foam swallowing its path. But it stayed on the ground. Alive. Passengers poured out into the cold December air, faces streaked with tears, their feet touching earth they weren't sure they'd ever see again. On the radio, the captain's voice returned, thick with emotion, trembling with gratitude. Munich Tower, all souls aboard safe. Whoever guided us, you saved 298 lives. His headset slipped slightly as her knees weakened. The adrenaline drained like floodwaters, leaving her hollow. She caught the desk with one hand, forcing herself upright. Looked at her, eyes wide, disbelief etched across his weathered face. My God, she actually did it. Evan's fury faltered, swallowed by the undeniable truth on the ground. It hadn't just worked. It had been the only way it could have worked. What happens when the impossible actually works? For a long moment after the Airbus came to a stop, the control room was silent, not triumphant, not loud, just silent, like the world itself had to breathe again. On the radar screen, the green echo of 441 sat motionless at the end of the runway, emergency vehicles swarming around it. Smoke curled up into the cold December air, the last remnants of a fight against gravity that should have ended in tragedy. Instead, 300 people were alive. Then the radio cracked with a voice that carried the weight of every heartbeat on that plane. Munich Tower, 441, we are safely on the ground, all souls aboard unharmed. I need to personally thank whoever coordinated that approach. In 22 years of flying, I've never seen guidance like that. You saved us. Swallowed hard, she wanted to answer, to say something, but her throat locked. Before she could reach for the mic, his voice unsteady. 441, this is Munich Tower. Your approach was coordinated by Specialist Anderson. His words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. The room turned toward her, eyes wide, some in shock, some in disbelief, some in quiet shame. The young woman they had doubted, dismissed, sidelined, had just done what none of them could. And she had done it flawlessly. Captain's voice came back, warm, thick with emotion. Specialist Anderson, thank you. You didn't just save an aircraft. You saved families, children, fathers, mothers. You gave us back our lives. I owe you everything. Closed her eyes, the weight of it all pressed against her chest, not pride, not victory, but release. All the lonely nights, all the whispered doubts, all the doors slammed in her face. They had led here to this, to saving strangers she would never meet. When she opened her eyes, the room hadn't moved, her colleagues still stared. Its expression was one of awe, looked pale, shaken. Even, who had once said she'd never survive an emergency, seemed hollowed out, his certainty cracked. And the director stepped forward slowly, his face unreadable. He looked at her as though seeing her for the first time. Anderson, he said quietly, how did you know? That routing wasn't in any manual, that descent profile wasn't in any emergency guide. How could you possibly? She held his gaze. For once, she didn't flinch. Because I've been preparing for this for over a year, she said simply. Every night, every weekend, I studied hydraulic failures, I built simulations, I mapped alternative approaches, I learned Munich's airspace inside out, I practiced until it was muscle memory. The words rolled out steady, without apology. I wasn't trying to undermine procedures. I was trying to be ready for the day when procedures wouldn't be enough. The room shifted. She could feel it, the disbelief giving way to something heavier, respect. Spoke first, his voice low. I thought your descent rates were too shallow, but watching that aircraft respond, I was wrong. You knew exactly what you were doing. Even who had laughed at her before whispered, she saved them, all of them. But's jaw tightened, his voice came sharper, defensive. Do you understand what you did? You the chain of command, you broke protocol, you endangered your career, the facility, everything. And saved 300 lives, interrupted, his gravel voice cutting like a blade. Don't forget that part. The tension cracked for once, had no reply. Doctor, the psychologist who had once told she was too emotional, finally spoke, her tone different now, softer. Your response today was not what we predicted. You didn't collapse under stress. You didn't let emotion cloud you. You channeled it. You turned it into focus. That's remarkable. Remarkable. The word echoed in his chest. For so long, her care had been a liability, her empathy, her weakness. Now they were seeing it for what it truly was, her strength. And then came the voice that mattered most. Munich Tower, captain again. His voice carried something more now, reverence. I want to know the name of the controller who brought us home, not the title, not the position, her name. Looked at, then back at the mic, Specialist Anderson. There was a pause, then the captain spoke again, clear and steady. Then I will never forget it, and neither will my crew, or the 298 passengers who walked off this aircraft tonight because of her. The weight of his words filled the tower, pushing past every wall, every doubt, every prejudice. His knees nearly buckled, she leaned on the console, her breath shallow. She had crossed the line. She had risked everything, and somehow, impossibly, she had not only saved lives, she had saved herself. Later, when the adrenaline drained and the tower's hum returned to normal, gathered the staff. His voice was clipped, but it carried a strange edge, not quite anger, not quite pride. Effective immediately, he announced. Specialist Anderson is assigned to the emergency operations team. Full authorization for crisis coordination. Her demonstrated expertise exceeds her current role. A ripple moved through the room. For months she had begged for a chance. For months she had been now, in one impossible hour, she had claimed it herself. Some still doubted, some still whispered, but others looked at her differently now, with something she hadn't seen before, respect. That night back in her apartment, sat among her charts and screens, but they looked different now. They weren't secret anymore. They weren't forbidden. They were proof that preparation matters, even when no one believes in you. She leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Exhaustion washed over her, relief and something else. For the first time in her life, she felt free. Because the truth was simple. She hadn't done it for recognition or promotion, or to silence the whispers. She had done it for the voices she couldn't see, for the families on that Airbus, for the children clutching their parents, for the captain whose voice had cracked under the weight of impossible responsibility. That was enough. And as she closed her eyes, one thought lingered like a prayer. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. What happens when a single voice becomes legend? The weeks after 441's emergency felt unreal. Munich Tower returned to its rhythms, the constant hum of radar, the clipped exchanges, the quiet choreography of men and women moving metal through the sky. But beneath that surface calm, something had changed. It began with whispers. Pilots who had been aboard Flight 441 spoke to colleagues in mess halls, in cockpits, in crew lounges across Europe. They spoke not about the storm, or the mechanical failure, or even their own survival. They spoke about the voice. The I've ever heard, even when we thought we were finished. She guided us like she'd flown that failure 100 times. She never once said we couldn't make it, only how we would. The story spread. It moved faster than any press release, faster than any official report. Pilots told other pilots, crews told other crews. Soon, across Europe, the name Anderson began to surface in quiet tones. Back in Munich Tower felt the shift. She was no longer invisible. Supervisors began assigning her to larger sectors, to busier streams of traffic, at first, hesitantly, as if testing whether her miracle had been luck. But day after day, she delivered the same calm efficiency, the same invisible choreography. Once skeptical, now asked her opinion during briefings, who had laughed at her before, deferred to her when weather grew complicated. Even stern, cold, stopped calling her Anderson and began using her first name. Still, the whispers lingered. Was it instinct? Or was it calculation? Could she do it again? Ignored them, she hadn't acted for recognition. She hadn't stepped forward for promotion. She had done it because she couldn't bear the thought of silence when lives trembled on the edge of the sky. And yet, recognition found her anyway. The first time it happened, she thought she'd misheard. A British Airways 777 on final called approach frequency. The captain's voice, calm but pointed, said, requesting vectors from the same controller who guided 441. The tower went silent. Colleagues exchanged startled glances, froze, her hand hovering over her console. She keyed the mic. British Airways 376, this is Specialist Anderson. I'll handle your approach. There was a pause, then the captain replied, his tone softer now. Copy that, glad it's you. The words pierced her deeper than any award or medal ever could. It wasn't an accident, it wasn't luck. Pilots remembered her voice, they trusted her. Soon it wasn't just one, captains, Turkish Airlines, Swiss Air, one by one. Flight crews began to request her on approach whenever they could, not Munich Tower, not the faceless system. Sir. At first, supervisors resisted. We can't play favorites. Assignments aren't personal. But the requests kept coming, and when traffic was heavy, when storms churned, when emergencies simmered on the edge of routine, one question hung unspoken in the air. Where Anderson? It reached the point where crews began referring to her in their own shorthand. Not Specialist Anderson. They called her Angel-7. It started with a captain. After a flawless night approach through crosswinds, he signed off with a chuckle. Appreciate the guidance, Angel-7. You kept us steady tonight. Her brows furrowed. She almost corrected him, but before she could, he was gone from frequency. The next week, a Swiss flight echoed it. Angel-7, that was some of the smoothest sequencing I've ever seen. And then another and another. Soon the call sign wasn't just on pilots' lips. It was whispered in the tower, sometimes with awe, sometimes with disbelief. Angel-7's got them. If anyone can guide this approach, it's Angel-7. The nickname spread like fire. She hadn't asked for it. She didn't even want it, but it clung to her like the storm she had once tamed. And with it came a weight heavier than she had ever carried. Because nicknames weren't just words, they were expectations. Every pilot who said Angel-7 wasn't just thanking her. They were believing she could save them, no matter what. Felt it every time she put on her headset. The quiet hum of the console now carried an echo, hundreds of voices she had never met, trusting her long before they spoke. It wasn't glory, it wasn't triumph, it was responsibility, the kind that gnawed at her in the quiet hours. In her apartment, the maps and charts remained, but now she looked at them differently, no longer secret, no longer forbidden. They were her armor, her silent vow that she would never let the trust of strangers outpace her readiness. Some nights she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she could bear it forever, the name, the weight, the legend she had never asked for. But then she remembered the voice of Captain, cracked with exhaustion, whispering his gratitude. She remembered the silence of 298 souls waiting for the ground to meet them again. And she knew. This wasn't about her. It never had been. It was about what happens when the world calls you too emotional, too weak, too unfit, and you refuse to let their judgment decide the value of your care. It was about the voices on the other side of the radio, trembling in fear, steadying when they heard her calm guidance. It was about dignity. And dignity doesn't speak. It acts. What happens when the world trusts you, but you no longer trust yourself? Months had passed since Flight 441, yet still woke some nights with her heart racing, hearing the captain's cracked voice in her dreams. She would sit up in the darkness, the hum of the city below, and listen to the silence as if waiting for another Mayday call to echo in her ear. Her life at the tower had changed, dramatically. Pilots requested her by name so often that schedules were quietly adjusted to make her available during peak hours. Angel-7 had spread beyond Munich, to Zurich, Vienna, London, even Madrid. Crews landing in Germany whispered about her before they checked in. The tower staff had changed, too. Some colleagues gave her a wide berth now, their pride bruised. Others sought her advice with a new respect, but always with a distance, as though afraid to step too close to someone who had crossed into legend. Even who once dismissed her, now measured his tone around her. He didn't praise her, but he didn't block her either. He simply tolerated the inevitability of what she had become. And that was the strange part. The louder her name grew outside the tower, the quieter her life felt inside it. She wasn't mocked anymore. She wasn't ignored. She was isolated, admired, yes, trusted, but alone. Because how do you talk about your day when people treat your words like prophecy? How do you share a laugh when every smile hides resentment or reverence? She missed being invisible. She missed the anonymity of failure. But then the emergencies came again, and each time the doubts and loneliness fell away, and she remembered why she stayed. It was a spring night when the call came. Mayday, Mayday, 8-2. Captain incapacitated, first officer at controls, request immediate priority. Blood chilled, a mechanical failure was one thing. A human collapse in the cockpit, that was chaos incarnate. The radar screen blinked with the echo of an Airbus A340 descending erratically. Voices around her sharpened, protocols clashed, medical units scrambled on the ground. But all she heard was the first officer's voice, young, tight with panic. Munich Tower, this is first officer, captain collapsed, breathing shallow, unresponsive. I don't know if I can get us down. Her chest tightened. He couldn't have been more than 30, alone, staring at a cockpit meant for two, carrying a plane full of lives. She pressed her headset closer. Her voice came soft, steady. First officer, this is Angel-7. You're not alone. I'll guide you. Breathe. Tell me your status. There was a pause, then a shaky exhale. Fuel 3 tons, descent unstable. I can't trim properly. Passengers, they know something's wrong. His words cracked. Fear bled through the radio. And felt it, the terror of responsibility too heavy for one pair of shoulders. Her tone sharpened. Listen to me. You've trained for this. You know that aircraft better than you think. Trust your instincts. I'll give you the path. All you have to do is follow my voice. Around her, colleagues watched. Some still bristled at the nickname, at the reverence pilots gave her. But none moved to stop her now. They knew emergencies weren't handled anymore unless spoke. She guided him step by step, gentle headings, shallow descents, reminders to breathe, to trust, to keep the aircraft stable. Minutes stretched, fuel dwindled, the captain lay unconscious in his seat, and through it all, his voice wove a thread of calm through the storm. Left heading 105, good, reduce thrust slightly, you're lined up beautifully. Breathe, don't forget yourself, you're doing it. Yes, you can, I've got you. Slowly, impossibly, the erratic descent steadied, the aircraft aligned with the runway. Emergency crews flooded the tarmac, foam trucks lined the strip, doctors waited at the ready. Munich Tower, His voice broke, trembling now. "I don't think I can flare it properly, You can," cut in gently. "Trust the machine, trust your training, trust me, bring her down." Seconds stretched into eternity. The radar echo slid across the final line. And then touchdown. Hard, rough, but alive. The cabin erupted in relief. Passengers sobbed. Crew members cried openly as doctors rushed to the cockpit. The captain was carried off, still unconscious but breathing. His voice came back, cracked and raw. "Angel-7, I couldn't have done it without you." Exhaled, her hands trembling beneath the console. She wanted to collapse, to weep, but her voice stayed steady. "You did it yourself," she whispered. "I was just here." The tower erupted again, but quieter this time, less shock, more reverence. Her colleagues didn't cheer. They didn't argue. They simply watched her with a mix of awe and unease. Because once again, the youngest, the most doubted, the one they had once dismissed, had carried the weight of lives with nothing but her voice. That night back in her apartment, stared at the call log, her name, or rather, the name pilots had given her, etched against another emergency saved. Angel-7. She hadn't chosen it. She hadn't wanted it, but now she understood it wasn't about legend, it wasn't about fame. It was about a voice, a human voice, steady in the dark, reminding others they weren't alone. And sometimes, that was enough to pull lives back from the edge. What remains after the storms are over? Years passed, yet the memory of Flight 441 still lingered like a watermark over Munich Tower. For those who were there, the sight of a wounded Airbus sliding safely onto the runway would never fade. For those who weren't, the story had already become part of aviation folklore. And at the center of that story was a name. Not written in manuals, not issued by command, not officially sanctioned. Angel-7. By now, the call sign had traveled far beyond Munich. Pilots from New York to Tokyo had heard of the voice that once guided an aircraft with no hydraulics through the impossible. They spoke of her with a mixture of respect and reverence, though many had never even seen her face. Requesting Angel-7 on approach. "If she's on frequency, I can breathe easier." She doesn't just guide aircraft, she steadies people. And inside the tower, something else had shifted. The same colleagues who once doubted her now leaned on her in silence. Older now, often deferred to her without hesitation. Once mocking, now carried an almost protective respect, stepping in quickly if anyone questioned her. Even proud, stern had softened. He never apologized outright, but the way he trusted her assignment spoke volumes. It wasn't just skill, others were skilled. It wasn't just knowledge, others studied the same charts. It was something harder to define, something that had always been dismissed in her as weakness. Care. That was her edge, her compass, her gift. And over the years, she proved it again and again. Emergencies, diversions, storms. Whenever fear clouded the airwaves, it was her voice that steadied the trembling hands on the other side. But herself never thought of legacy. She never chased the title. She never sought the name. She only thought of the families she could not see, strapped into metal and trust, waiting for a voice to promise they weren't alone. One winter evening, long after the legend had become part of everyday routine, she sat at her console during a storm. Winds howled. Lightning painted the Bavarian sky in violent flashes. A Turkish Airlines flight checked in, its captain weary, his words clipped with strain. Munich Tower, where heavy, low fuel diverting attempts failed, request expedited approach. Without hesitation, answered. Turkish 391, "This is Angel-7, you're safe, I'll guide you." The pause on the radio said everything. Relief, recognition, trust. "Copy Angel-7, the captain replied, softer now. "Glad it's you tonight." And just like that, the storm felt smaller. It wasn't a miracle, it wasn't a rescue. The aircraft landed safely, as dozens did every night. No headlines, no applause, just another thread in the quiet tapestry of safety that kept the world aloft. But as she sat there, headset resting gently against her hair, realized something profound. Her greatest victories were not the dramatic saves, not the impossible emergencies. They were the thousands of uneventful landings guided by steady hands, calmed hearts, and unseen trust. That was the true weight of being Angel-7. Not glory, not legend, responsibility. Responsibility carried in silence. Later that night, when her shift ended, she walked out of the tower alone. The air was cold, the city lights blinking far below, the world blissfully unaware of how close it always lived to the edge. She paused at the door, looking back at the tower that had once been her cage and was now her sanctuary. She remembered the laughter, the dismissals, the years of invisibility, and she remembered the voices, terrified, pleading, breaking, that had found calm because she refused to remain silent. She smiled faintly, though her eyes carried the weight of every call, every life. Because she understood now what she had always known deep down. Strength isn't always loud. It doesn't always shout. It doesn't always demand recognition. Sometimes strength is a quiet woman with a headset, guiding the lost home through storms. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.